So let's begin. Let me say welcome to the third of 4 lectures in our summer series of talks. Hello to those of you who are joining us today on Zoom and those of you who are joining us in the future on YouTube. A quick word about format. Dr. Elliot Hanowski will present his research in 20 minutes, and I'll be guarding that time. Then there will be a 20-minute period in which he will engage in conversation with someone who knows the research field quite well. In this case, the interlocutor is Dr. Tina Block, a history professor at Thompson Rivers University, and she was just here with us at the center for several months. She'll be joining us through the wonders of Zoom. After Elliot and Tina talk for 20 minutes, I'll chair a discussion period with members of the actual and virtual audiences for the final 20 minutes. So our speaker today is Elliot Hanowski, a scholar librarian at the University of Manitoba. He's one of the founders of the International Society for Historians of Atheism, Secularism, and Humanism. He completed a BA in history from our shared alma mater, the University of Winnipeg, and then went on to Queen's University for both an MA and a PhD in history. He finished his PhD in 2015 and then completed a master's degree in library and information studies at the University of Alberta in 2021. His work has addressed the rise in unbelief and the general deterioration of conventional modes of identification and practice in Canada. His first book is with us here today, Toward a Godless Dominion, Unbelief in Interwar Canada, published by McGill-Queens University Press in 2023. Elliot's research helps us see more clearly the tectonic shifts that have occurred in Canadian society, not just religious changes, but also changes in social structure, gender relations, and political formations. So this is a good point to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Wisconsin peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. So now please join me in welcoming Elliot.
Thank you. I'm here to talk, basically about the research that I ended up putting into my book, which came out last October. So it looks at the interwar period, so that's the 1920s and 30s in Canada. And, this was a period which was very, on the surface at least, seemed very Christian. 95% of people in the census said that they were one kind of Christian or another, with, some Jewish people and then a few other, international or more, other religions outside of those two main ones. And there was a very tiny minority of people who said that they had no religion or were atheists or rationalists or secularists or something else. But what I found in my research is I started digging into this, the archives of a rationalist organization that was formed in 1925 in Winnipeg. And I started to find that there was a lot going on. It was a very active organization, and I started to find there were other groups like it across the country that were engaged in this struggle against religion, against Christianity specifically. So that's how I sort of fell into this topic and realized that there was a story, a counter story happening in the 1920s and 30s of people who were, despite this seemingly overwhelming dominance of Christianity, were quite struggling against religion as a whole. So my introduction sort of looks at the context, but then in my first couple chapters, I look at Winnipeg because that's where the best evidence is from. There's this man named Marshall Gauvin. He was born in New Brunswick, and he was a carpenter. He's from a working class background, and he became a full-time rationalist lecturer in 1912. He traveled around to the States, through Canada, and then eventually ended up in Winnipeg. He was invited by the One Big Union, which was a radical Marxist union that came out of the Winnipeg General Strike of 1919. So they invited him. He found a warm welcome, and he founded this Winnipeg Rationalist Society in 1926. And when he grew to a very old age, I think he lived to be 98, and he donated all of his papers to the University of Manitoba archives, which is how we have access to his records and the records of the society. So that's why I sort of center Winnipeg. He made a living by lecturing on a weekly basis. Every Sunday evening, he would give a rationalist talk, and except for the summers, which he took off. But he would battle local gurus and pseudoscientists and really go after fundamentalists. This was the age of the fundamentalist modernist clash, the 1920s. He had debates with people. He would debunk sermons. Sometimes he would advertise in his weekly ad. His ad, it would say, "This tonight I'm going to debunk the sermon that was given by so and so, at this church, and show how he was completely wrong." Right. And so, and when it was just very popular. He would get audiences of 300 to 700 people at a lecture. He had some debates with fundamentalists that brought in a crowd of 3,000 people, so many that they had to book 2 theaters to have everybody, so one would listen in and one would be the debate itself. He would go after mostly fundamentalists, but often fundamentalists, but most regularly he was clashing with sort of more moderate clergymen because he felt they were giving people a false sense of trying to make Christianity acceptable to the modern world. But he was like, no, it's completely, the whole thing is rotten through and through. So he would often clash with them. After a few years, he kind of broke with the One Big Union because his politics were kind of a more jumble of some socialist ideas and some liberal ideas, and they clashed on questions of economics because he tried to branch out and talk about other things other than religion, and so he would talk about economics and psychology and other society and so forth. So he butted heads with the One Big Union. Through the 1930s, the Great Depression in the 1930s, however, he became involved with Popular Front, the struggle against fascism, Popular Front causes, and became very enthusiastic about the Soviet Union, even though he sort of had some of those liberal commitments. But then, he was involved with the On to Ottawa Trek and the struggle for Republican Spain. But then when the Soviets signed a pact with the non-aggression pact with the Nazis, he was just sort of heartbroken and became very disillusioned. And this was the 1940s when he stopped lecturing, partly because the context was changing. People weren't going to lectures as much, but partly because of this break, I think, with many in his audience who were still quite enthusiastic about the Soviet Union. And then he quit being a lecturer, and then for the rest of his life, he would continue to write, but he became very much a sort of a cold warrior, turned against sort of the left that he had once supported, and continued to write for rationalist journals, but he never really lectured after that. So, because I have access to the lecture, to the not only the lectures but also all of the paperwork from his society, I was able to dig into those membership lists and see who were these people that were associated with his group. And for the most part, they were pretty much all white. They tended to be drawn from sort of the skilled working class. Many of them were involved with the running trade, which was the railways. Most had immigrated from the UK or from Eastern Canada in the past 10 or 20 to 30 years. And so English, Scottish, and other European nationalities were mostly represented. Interestingly enough, about 30 to 40% of the membership list were women, which was pretty high for a rationalist group. They tend to be very heavily male. And there were about up to 1,000 people who I found associated with his group, at least enough to donate or to be considered a member. And yeah, it was a mixture of communities. There were also some secular Jews there. There were some Icelandic ex-Unitarians, a few sort of a cross section of different communities. And it was about 40% blue collar with 20% clerical, and then some small business owners, professionals as well. So as I did this research, I started to realize that there was a similar group actually in Toronto that was founded around the same time. And so but then I also came across this conflict that put rationalism really in the newspaper headlines around this time in Toronto as well. And so there was a man named Ernest Sterry. He was British. He came to settle in Toronto, and he lost his job and he was out of work. So he decided to write a rationalist newspaper, and he went around handing it to people, including to members of the provincial government, which turned out to be a bad idea because they quickly charged him with blasphemous libel and arrested him and put him on trial. So this was in 1927. He had a lawyer who was actually probably Toronto's first Black lawyer, a man named Ethelbert Lionel Cross. who was a fellow rationalist, and the case received massive press attention. People said, this is the Scopes trial, the famous monkey trial over evolution. This is the Scopes trial for Canada. This is a huge deal. And Sterry wanted to make, this sort of dramatic courthouse stand over, the unbelief versus belief, but it didn't really work out. He was found guilty. They appealed. That also failed. He was sentenced to 6 months in prison, and they tried to deport him, although they weren't able to because he'd been in Canada for a certain amount of time. And so J.S. Woodsworth, the famous social democratic or democratic socialist politician, and some of his allies in Parliament tried to get the law of blasphemous libel repealed, but they failed. The vast majority of parliamentarians were opposed to that. Canada was still seen very much as a Christian society in which the government defended the churches. So then I looked more at the organization in Toronto, the Rational Society of Canada, which started with street lectures in about 1925. Again, we see that same time period these groups emerging. They moved to indoor lecturing in 1926. And they, unlike Gauvin's group, which was centered around him, in this group they had many lecturers, often it was sort of led by a man named Bert Levins and his friend William Stiles, but they had invited many different lecturers to come and talk to them. They tended to be speaking on primarily rationalist topics up until the Great Depression, in which case they started to switch to having a broader focus on other topics, so social issues, economic issues. And they got caught up in what were called the free speech struggles in the late 20s, the early 1930s in Toronto, where there was huge clashes between communist groups, left-wing groups, and the police, which would crack down on them and force them to try to arrest them, force them to break up their meetings and so forth. So the rationalists were right in the middle of that. Their meetings as well were being broken up. And so I argue that the Sterry case was kind of just the opening shots in a broader struggle that was happening in Toronto between this sort of evangelical Protestant establishment that wanted to keep Toronto the good, locked down for Christianity, and then these sort of more radical groups that were struggling and trying to test that hegemony. There were controversies over atheism among university students, and there were other things that were happening around this whole dreaded specter of unbelief and atheism. And then later in that chapter, I go on to talk about this group called the Christian Crusade Against Atheism, which was sort of an evangelical initiative started in Toronto, sort of to spearhead this counterattack against unbelief. And then I move on to what was Canada's largest city at the time, Montreal, which had, of course, Quebec was the site of intense clerical nationalism. Catholicism was very much hegemonic. It ran, the schools, it ran the hospitals, the charities, the social services. It was extremely powerful. But there was this tradition of anti-clericalism that you can trace back to sort of people who were promoting Voltaire back in the 18th century. So the person I look at was a man named Albert Saint-Martin, who started out in the early 20th century as sort of with liberal politics and then moving into socialism and then communism. He was a member of the Communist Party, but then they kicked him out because he said, I think Quebec should have its own communist or its own wing of the Communist Party. And they said, get out of here. That's nationalist, bourgeois nonsense. So he said, well, fine. And so he went and started his own organization called the Université Ouvrière, which is the workers' university. And so it was based in some of the poorest, he had sort of little meeting houses in some of the poorest neighborhoods in Montreal, and was trying to get people to come to lectures and teaching them how to give their own talks. He had a little library that people could learn about radical ideas, and but there was this heavy emphasis on anti-religious topics. Contemporary observers said that by far the most common topic that was that he would lecture on, or that his people would lecture on, was against the church. And then, of course, the Great Depression hits, and things get even worse for these people who are already suffering. And so they formed, Albert Saint-Martin formed this organization called the Association Humanitaire, which was aimed at alleviating people's suffering, and also trying to demand the secular provision of relief rather than have it through the Catholic Church. So part of their program was to get people to renounce their membership in the Catholic Church. So the local bishop was complaining about getting hundreds of letters from people saying, I no longer wish to be Catholic. But that was tied in with their opposition to the church providing all the social services and having such a stranglehold on sort of civil society. So there was this two-pronged approach that they took. Of course, there was intense backlash. Albert Saint-Martin was tried for blasphemous libel, found guilty, but he was also attacked in the streets by fascists and badly beaten, even though he was getting on in years. His library was taken out in the street and burned by radical Catholic students who would come and break up the meetings again and again. Eventually, his lieutenant, a man named Gaston Pilon, was sentenced to prison for blasphemous libel for hard labor for a year, and he broke under pressure and converted to Catholicism very spectacularly. Like, local Catholics were overjoyed that God had intervened and saved the soul of this man. And so Saint-Martin was sort of forced to withdraw from public activism. And he ended, similarly to Gauvin, he would write a little bit, but then he didn't lecture anymore. So then I also look at unbelief on the coasts. So there's less evidence to work with there, but I looked at British Columbia and Nova Scotia as two examples. What I did was I looked at controversies around religion that provided a sort of an open public discussion, about religion that allowed atheists and unbelievers to come and make their voices heard. And so in British Columbia, there was a big controversy around faith healing in 1923. A man named Charles Price, who was conducting a faith healing revival, and there was this split between the churches. Some of whom said, "Well, we don't, we want to have a revival, but we don't believe in faith healing anymore." And so this provided a space for unbelievers to make their voices heard and say, not only is faith healing bunk, but all religion is bunk, right? And so there were people like A. Mackay Jordan who were publishing these big ads in the local newspapers saying, faith is bunk, religion is nonsense. And what he was doing though was promoting, so he said, he promoted a short-lived rationalist organization of his own, but he was also trying to promote his business, which believed that he could heal he was like a pseudoscientist who believed he could heal people's illnesses by changing the electricity that was pouring into their bodies through their eyes. It's very strange. But he teamed up with some actual local rationalists who were trying to promote this critique of religion. And so I looked a little bit at a man named William J. Curry, who was giving a lot of rationalist lectures in Vancouver. In Nova Scotia, I look at this controversy around a textbook that mentioned evolution in 1933. Local fundamentalists really stirred up a fuss about this, and were like, circulating petitions and having big mass meetings about it. And so in this conflict too, we see a few secularists speak up and say, sort of make a case against religion as a whole and saying it's not just the fundamentalists, but religion as a whole is obscurantist and blinkered and okay, thank you, and clashing with science, and so we need to throw the whole thing overboard. And so there were some local leftists like Roscoe Fillmore, Charles MacDonald, who were labor radicals, who were speaking out against religion in that context, but they tended to be very circumspect. And what I found was, even though we could find these secularists speaking up on both coasts, British Columbia, of course, the context was very different. It tended to be more secular. About 1.5% of the population said they had no religion, which was quite high compared to the rest of the country. And Nova Scotia, of course, tended to be more, I shouldn't say of course, but at that time it did tend to be more conservative. But in both places, the popular press and the sort of the local, spokespeople and professors and teachers and politicians tended to take this sort of moderate Christian stance. So unbelief was still quite marginal in both places, at least that kind of outspoken unbelief. So to wrap up, so the lessons that I took, about from this time period, many histories of free thought talk about this golden age in the 19th century and how it ended in 1900 or 1914, and then it's true there was a generational shift. But I argue in my book that the tradition continued in Canada into the 20s and 30s. It shows us that Canada was very much part of Christendom, this system where the state defended the churches, and most people thought that was just the way things should be. So that there were laws like blasphemous libel, or also there were laws, customs officials would stop atheistic material at the border and refuse to let it into the country. There were strong ties in Canada between the left and between rationalists and secularists and the left. So a number of them were involved with various socialist movements. Some of them ended up giving up lecturing and becoming socialist politicians instead, especially during the Great Depression, during this crisis of capitalism. And it was very difficult for these sorts of people to focus just on religion. They found they had to deal with politics as well. And finally, just it tells us something about the social context, of this time. These organizations had a very strong working class base, sort of among the artisans or the skilled working classes. And these people were all autodidacts. Only Curry in British Columbia had a degree, and that was in dentistry. So these were all self-taught people. Whereas in later humanist movements, we see that led by doctors and psychiatrists and people like that. And in this time period, lecturing, you could still get large crowds of people out to come and listen to your lectures. But then as radio and movies and cars start to cut into that, lecturing loses its popularity, and these kind of unbelievers lose their audience as well. So that's the quick version of my book.
Okay. Okay, now the next 20 minutes we spend in sort of enjoying a conversation between Tina and Elliot. Go ahead, Tina.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks so much, Elliot, and thanks to the CSRS for inviting me to engage in this conversation. I'm so happy to have you trapped here for a bit of time and to be able to talk about your really interesting work, which has been really important in history for understanding the history of unbelief and atheism and so on in Canada, but also for enriching our understanding of Canada more generally. So yeah, I'm just really pleased to have this opportunity. My first question or sort of thought about your presentation builds on your final comments about the interwar period. And I'm just wondering if you can speak a bit more to what was distinct or perhaps not about that period, particularly in terms of the history of unbelief. Like, is this a time, I know it's people who declare themselves to be non-believers in various ways are a very small minority, but is this a time period when that's increasing, decreasing, staying the same? And then also, to what extent did the wider context shape that, right? That trajectory of unbelief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. Like on paper, in the census and things like that, like I said, 95% of people said they belong to one church or another. But there were little hints of perhaps some disillusionment or a certain amount of skepticism, right? Like one thing that I look at in my book, for example, is like a lot of the literature that was coming out by war veterans who were writing war novels in the 1920s and 30s. There's very often a strong criticism of religion and of the ideas of Christianity. Like, how could God permit such horrible, meaningless suffering and despair and destruction?
Mm-hmm.
And there are people are reading books like Sinclair Lewis's Elmer Gantry. There's these critics which are a satire on religion. There are these hints of skepticism and slightly more, people are getting up in arms about hip flasks and jazz orchestras and flappers, right? And there's this kind of irreverence in the society that Canada doesn't partake in as much as the States does, but it is there, right? So there are these little hints. But yeah, and I think, and those clashes this is the modernist and fundamentalist clash that took place in the 1920s, where people are arguing about evolution. And the Scopes trial I talk about in the book, of 1925, where they have this trial against a man who's teaching evolution in Tennessee. And it becomes this big clash between the fundamentalists as led by William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow, who's a sort of a sarcastic, agnostic lawyer. And so it's seen as this clash between religion and unbelief. And so there's space for these kind of more skeptical voices to come out. But yeah, as a whole, Christianity was still very hegemonic in society overall. And most people just thought that was the normal way of things. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And do you think that like the context of the Great Depression, which you did touch on, like, do you think, and I know I think there's like different takes on this, like, do you think it gave a boost to irreligion, unbelief in terms of, the sort of widespread sense of despair, or the reverse, right? Or do you have any sense of that?
Yeah, my understanding is that, historians of religion don't see much in the way of like a revival or anything like that happening during the Great Depression, because most people were just too busy trying to survive. And there is this kind of, sense of despair. And like some people, I think, turn to religion to try and find hope and solace. But, I think it did lead to a widespread questioning of social systems, capitalism, and the government as it stood. And so there was this kind of openness to like, well, what else? Like, this is obviously not working. Like, what else can we do? And I think that's, among that doesn't necessarily lead people to unbelief, but it did open up space for some of this more radical critique of things. And so that the secularist activists that I look at, they all sort of had to engage with that, because people, people were suffering so much. It was so widespread, so that it led most of them to start talking about politics. And like, so okay, so maybe we throw God out, but then like, how does a godless society look? What does it look like? How should we live our lives?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so interesting. And yeah, I love how you've given us insight into these various speakers and groups across Canada. And I'm wondering, to what extent were they linked with one another, right? Was this like a national movement, or were they aware of each other? Were they talking to each other? Or was this more of a disjointed kind of thing?
Yeah, as far as I could tell, there was like no formal contact between them. Canada was very much an archipelago of little communities scattered out across this huge country, and they had more contact with American counterparts than they did with each other. Gauvin did give a talk about the Sterry trial, the blasphemy trial, but he doesn't seem to have been in contact with the Toronto rationalists. And of course, between Quebec and the Anglophones, they didn't really have any contact either. Some of them were a little bit involved with some of the same left-wing causes, and there's like a couple of left-wing activists who I kept running into at the various points in the book. So there was some like left connections, and there was a man named I'm blanking on his name. There was a British rationalist lecturer who'd come and tour across the country and speak to different communities. I think most of them met with him. So there were these connections to Britain and to the US, but not really to each other.
That's so interesting. And I'm thinking about something that I've grappled with, looking at like the history of secular humanism in the post-war era. Look in these ongoing discussions in the humanist movement about like, what is our focus? Is it to tear down religion or challenge religion, advocate for the separation of church and state and these sorts of things, and challenge various laws? Or is our focus on trying to create something new? And I'm wondering, in your work, if you found that, is there any debate about, like, is the focus of these various groups and speakers that you've looked at, is it essentially challenging religion, or is there something else going on as well?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. There's somebody who knew Gauvin when he was working out of I think he was living in the States, and he was running a rational society in like, I think, Indianapolis, or maybe it was Minneapolis. And they said, well, I don't want to go to his lectures because like God died a long time ago. I don't need to go every Sunday to hear him get buried again and again, right? Like, what's the point? Right. So sometimes, like, on the one hand, the criticism of religion, that was like Gauvin's most people that came to his meetings really loved how he would attack religion and smash it. And he was a great showman, like he was a great orator, and could like imitate revivalists and make fun of them, and like make fun of pastors and stuff. So like that clash was very popular, but it did have this kind of, I don't know, best before date, like where it's like after a while, like we need to talk about something else, like how should society look, right? Like what. And so I think that's why he tried to branch out into economics and psychology and sociology and things like that. but he didn't have as much background in understanding those things as he did in, understanding the Bible, say. And that's when he got in conflict with some of his allies who were on the left, and as the One Big Union started to shift more towards Marxism, and then Gauvin comes along and gives a lecture saying, oh, we don't have to worry about capitalism in the long run because workers and owners are going to start sharing profits and it'll all work out in the long, it's all going to work out. And they were like, no, that's not what we believe, right? So they ended up butting heads over some of those questions. So when you get into politics and these concrete questions, you can make allies or you can make enemies, right? So it becomes divisive. And so, yeah, and I think the Toronto group did it more successfully. They started branching out into questions of, actually one of their first lectures, even before they kind of branched out more into politics, but one of the first lectures in 1927, I think, was they had someone come and talk about birth control, which was still a very controversial topic. It was still illegal at the time to disseminate information on birth control, but this is something that rationalists and secularists were into because they believed that Christian notions of restrictions on sexuality were irrational, right? And so, but then yeah, into the 1930s, you definitely see them branching out more and talking about, like, they had all kinds of lectures from labor unions, and socialists, and communists, and other kinds of radicals, feminists, coming and talking to them about, how can we change society for the better? How can we create something new? And definitely you saw that in Montreal as well. So, yeah, there was this, like, it can be very popular to kill God, but like after a while, you're like, okay, now what, right? What's next?
Yeah, that's super interesting and definitely resonates with some of the work that I've done. And so are these, I'm interested in sort of terminology, what they were calling themselves, so rationalists and so on, secularists and things like that. And then thinking about, do you see these various movements and speakers and leaders as forerunners of the humanist movement in Canada, which sort of crystallizes, I guess, in the 50s and 60s? Is there a clear trajectory or clear line between those groups and the sort of more modern, I guess, humanist movement in Canada?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I think so they call themselves rationalists in Toronto and Winnipeg, and in Vancouver as well. There was like William Curry would talk about sort of rationalist ideas. In Montreal, they called themselves communists, like small c communists, because they clashed with the regular, the regular Communist Party was like, you should be organizing the workers, not attacking religion. What are you doing? So they had differences of opinion there. But then, yeah, in 1935, Marshall Gauvin changes the name of his group to the Winnipeg Humanist Society. So that language of humanism emerged in the early 1930s and started to be picked up. So I think rationalists started to seem a little bit old-fashioned, and so they were shifting a little bit to that new language of humanism. But I don't actually see much continuity between these groups and the humanist groups later, because these were pretty much all, well, not all, but like, I don't know, like 70% like working class, upper working class people, and working with these self-taught, like Gauvin never had any higher education. Like, it was all self-taught. They would read a lot of books, they would give a talk, they would debate people. It was very different intellectual milieu. Whereas looking, at least my understanding of the 1950s and 60s, when you see these humanist groups emerging, it's all highly educated psychiatrists, doctors, other professionals, people, and most of their audience seems to be coming from these sort of more middle class, highly educated constituencies, right? And so even if the word humanist gets picked up by both sets of groups, it's like I don't see much follow through there.
That's so interesting. And do you have a sense, or can you speculate what accounts for that shift with sort of activists kind of out, what we might call unbelief or anti-religion? What accounts for that class shift in terms of, or do you know, or can you speculate? I'd like to know. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a good question. I wish I knew too. Yeah. I mean, there's a few things that happen. There is that sort of culture of lecturing that could attract people again and again, and that was like a very easy platform for the rationalists to get up on and like to spread their message, and that goes away, right? Even Gauvin towards the end, somebody later asks him, and he says, oh, like people were going to see movies, people had automobiles, they had radios, they would sit at home listen to the radio, like they didn't want to come out to lectures as much anymore. And so it was, you know, even in the last few days of his, or last few years of his lecturing career, you could see that shift happening. So I think that's, and there was a kind of a working class culture that went along that lecturing, that was tied up with that lecturing culture. And so that's one big shift. I think the Cold War happens too, right? And so like you get the, I don't know, a lot of that working class radicalism kind of gets pushed, you know, yeah, it becomes less respectable in some ways. Yeah, and I think the spread of more, I mean, it's even, yeah, I guess that happens more in the 1960s, but when that growth of like more people started going to college, right, and going on to some sort of higher education, whereas in the 20s and 30s, like I think there was a scholar who says like sometimes people's natural aptitudes were not matched with their educational opportunities, right? Like you get these people who are very articulate, very bright, and like wanted to grapple with these ideas, but they didn't have the chance to go to university. So then they could maybe become a rationalist lecturer instead, right? Whereas then as the 20th century progresses, there's more opportunities to go to school and get that formal education.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I've been asking a bit about terminology among these groups, but I'm wondering about your own use of terminology, and your work has informed my own use of terminology for sure. But can you talk a bit about how you landed on the term unbelief, like in your, using that term? I know you've published various articles about that, and yeah, how did you land on that term?
Well, it's something that some other scholars started using, and I kind of found it useful for the same reasons they did, because it's not linked to any one particular movement or organization, right? Like, and it's kind of a nice umbrella term, some ways, because there's like secularism, which is more the British terminology which then moves into rationalism. In the States, they talk about free thought or free thinkers. And then we sort of see this shift to humanism. Not all these people were atheists, many of them were, some of them were agnostics. And so there's like all of these different terms that have like different meanings in different national contexts, in different decades. So unbelief served just as a catch-all for that, and could address like the wide variety. So you have like anti-clerical people who are maybe deists who believe in some sort of God, but then you have like hardcore atheists who reject all supernatural concepts. And so unbelief kind of gives you a nice umbrella to talk about these things. On the other hand, it does have its drawbacks, because it does privilege belief, right? And like, or the idea of like what makes these people tick is their lack of beliefs in things, which is a very Protestant Catholic, or a very Protestant Christian thing. Not it's whereas as modern scholars of religion are like very much been grappling with that, like what is religion, if there's belonging and there's behaving a certain way and there's eating this and not doing that, right, as opposed to just believing it. So there are, and I talk a little bit about how there are indications that there were a lot of secular Jews in for example in Toronto in this time period as well, and like, but then the scholar who's working on that was talking about, well, and the way you can tell that is because they stopped following Sabbath restrictions, or instead of going to a rabbi for conflict resolution, they would go to a local court. They would take it to court and sue one another. And so that's how you could tell they were no longer a Jew, right, or a practicing religious Jew. So that idea of belief and unbelief comes very much out of a Christian framework, and it doesn't necessarily apply as well to others. But yeah, so I recognize its shortcomings, but it can also be useful as well.
Yeah, great. That's definitely aligns with and it has informed my own thinking about it for sure. So thank you for that. I'm just gonna, I know I only have maybe a couple minutes or a minute or a couple, but I'm just gonna shift gears here and ask a little bit about women. And you mentioned women as members of the audience and as attending these various things, and being members of these groups. And I just wonder if you could speak a bit more to gender. Are there any women leaders of these groups? And also, do you see sort of gendered kind of language, I guess, or discussions about gender and women in the lectures and things like that, as that relates to rationalism and unbelief and that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's interesting because these movements have always been heavily masculine, at least, you know, in that time, in the sort of the 19th century and the early 20th century. And I think one of Gauvin's accomplishments was managing to attract a lot of women to his lectures, partly because he was building off of some of these existing working class cultures that women were participating in, I think. And his lectures, like, there was this sort of sense of respectability and like where a respectable woman could go, you know, and so I think he managed to make his lectures a respectable space for women. So they do, and there do seem to have been a few who were involved in helping organize his society and like running local study groups and things like that. But you know, he was very much like a one-man show. In Toronto, we do see about 4 or 5 women lecturers who would sometimes give talks about, you know, different issues. And one woman in particular, Jean Lang, who was a socialist and a trade union activist, but she seems to have given a number of lectures, including some on women and secularism, or like what, you know, like why are so many women religious, or like what can secularism do, you know, rationalism do for women's liberation and that kind of thing. So there was some presence there, but yeah, they're not a very they didn't leave many records behind, and they're not a very prominent part of, like, yeah, it's hard to just, it's like, yeah, they're not always showing up in the records that well, right? And so it's hard to know like how much they were involved. And you know, most of the leaders that I ended up having material on were, yeah, these male leaders, right? So
yeah,
but there was these sense, like there were some of the clashes that happened in this time period around ideas of like birth control, like I said, or abortion, right? Or the idea of companionate marriage, the idea that a marriage, you know, that rationalists would sometimes criticize Christian ideas of marriage as kind of this kind of legalized prostitution, right? Or as this bondage for women. And so there were certain proto-feminist ideas at play there. But it wasn't always their main focus.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tina. I really appreciate that level of engagement with Elliot. Thanks a lot. Stick around if you will. So now the last 15 or so minutes, we'll have an opportunity to have conversation from the floor, but also there are a couple questions, I think, on Zoom from the Zoom audience. Can we go to Zoom first, and then,
sure,
yeah, and then we'll go to Peter, and then to Yanni.
So from Brian Cragen, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yep.
In my research on organized secularism, there is some evidence that many of the people who join the groups are initially attracted to these groups for support as they work their way out of religion and work through any issues they have as a result of their religious experience. But for a lot of those people, they eventually work religion out of their system, and then they are ready to move on to life. It sounds like you observed something similar in the interwar period. Obviously, some people stay involved, but do you have a sense of how many people utilize these groups as, quote, way stations as they left religion and constructed new identities outside religion? And any insights on who stays involved and who passes through?
No, it's a really good question, Ryan. Yeah, it's hard to say, right? Because like all I have is these fragments of, you know, information about the rank and file. But yeah, there are those, like I said, that, you know, mentioned that anecdote about the guy who says he doesn't need to hear God killed over and over again, right? So there does seem to have been a like, at least, and Gauvin found it hard to make a living in when he was living in these different American cities, because there were people there who were unbelievers, but who no longer felt the need to rehash the arguments over and over again, and who had just moved on to other issues. And so then this is a difference we see sometimes in the British and American context as well, where like there's certain movement of people into radical politics or into other, you know, literary pursuits or things like that, where they as you say, they came to these movements to for support and as a way to help reinvent themselves as a secular person, but then they don't necessarily stick with it. but yeah, it's very difficult to say, like, maybe at some point I'll be able to, like, go through the membership list by year and see like who stayed, how many people stayed throughout the whole period and how many just kind of left. But yeah, I don't have a lot of information.
Thanks, Ryan. Good to see you. Good to hear you again. Peter, and then Devyani.
Just briefly, blasphemous libel is a crime I haven't heard of before. Did some of your people work to collapse that law, or what happened to that law?
It was in force, well, it was in the law books until 2018, in which case
2018.
Oh, you just missed it.
I did.
You could have been, yeah.
yeah, so it was, I mean, you could say that the descendants of these people helped get rid of it, because like the Center for Inquiry and Humanist Canada and stuff were helped lobby to get that off the books. It hadn't been used since the 1930s, where it was used in Quebec numerous times, sometimes against unbelievers, excuse me, and sometimes against Protestants who were criticizing Catholicism. They were blamed for like charge of blasphemous libel.
Cheeky.
The only time it gets used in English Canada that I found is the Sterry case, and that's when J.S. Woodsworth and his allies tried to get it taken out of the law books, but then like pretty much all the other parliamentarians just shout it down and say, no, Canada's Christian. We should, we have to have these laws. Most other countries have these laws, and if we got rid of ours, well, then all the atheists would come here, and we don't want that. Right? So, yeah.
Thank you. You drive up real estate prices or something.
Yeah.
Devyani?
Hi, it seems that Tina and I are having too many conversations because she read my mind and I lost 2 questions to her. So I was very intrigued by the class shift in both the lecturers as well as the audience. I wanted to know if you have worked on this, the racial and gender demographics of this new audience and lecturers, in the sense. You mentioned that he made it a respectable space, and you mentioned the respectable woman. And I do, I mean, as to my knowledge, the respectable woman at that time was a class privileged white housewife. So I'm very curious about the intersection of race and gender in this space. Then in Tina's lecture, we also saw religion as a community. So were these spaces also sort of a community?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, the Winnipeg group, as far as I could tell, was entirely white, as much as Irish and Jewish people were considered white in that time period. But yeah, and Gauvin, I don't know, he like when the KKK came through Winnipeg and were trying to fundraise and stuff, he was staunchly opposed to them. But he also said stuff about how Black people are less intelligent than white people. And the first version of the KKK in the late 19th century, they were defending us from the men, or defending white women from the Black menace, right? So like he had those racist ideas baked in, and partly because he got so much of his thinking from books, like he just soaked those ideas right up, right? That were quite prominent in those days. So yeah, I'm not surprised that there weren't any people of color at his meetings. Although there, he was better on anti-Semitism, for example. But the Toronto group is interesting because they had Lionel Cross, like the first Black lawyer in Toronto, who was a member, who gave lectures there, and so there does seem to have been more a little bit more representation of people of color in Toronto. Although, yeah, I don't have a whole lot of information beyond his presence there. And yeah, I think the Quebec scene was pretty much white as far as I could tell, as well. So these were very much white movements, and and that's something that you see throughout the history of these secularist movements, right? And although there are Nathan Alexander has written a book on like the questions of race and free thought in the 19th century, and so I hope there's also going to be people working on that in the 20th century. The other question, I guess, on community, I think definitely it was a tight knit, or I don't know, tight knit is the right word, but it was something to do every Sunday, to see your friends and visit with them, and it was an alternative to church for many of these people, I believe. And there are little hints here and there in the remaining records of like, oh yeah, we have a social club on Thursday nights, or like we get together and we have a secular Christmas party for the kids, because it's not fair that these atheists, these children of atheists don't get to have a party at Christmas, right? So they would have little social events like that as well, and like sometimes they would have music before the lecture, and then they would have like a question period at the end or a discussion period. Like in the Montreal group, they had there's a sense of these people were desperately poor, but this provided them a little bit of like social support as well.
Just coming back to because you said right at the beginning that the golden age of free thought in the 19th century, but then Canada has this. I'm sort of curious about, so when Royal did his sort of major work on this stuff back in the 70s and 80s, the conclusion argument of why it dies out is essentially the secularist movement in Britain is successful. They get Bradlaugh into Parliament, the oath is reformed, and education reform is coming such that church schools are not the only thing you've got in town. So basically the movement ceases to be really relevant because the political things they were chasing, they largely succeed at. But I guess, so is the sense then that the reason interwar Canada is kind of fertile for these is because Canada is still, looks a bit more like that Victorian England with the hegemony of the churches. And so there's that kind of, the logic of the state is still such that it permits the movements to have a fertile ground to argue from. The fact that there isn't blasphemous libel still to charge people with, is that sort of maybe an argument for why the golden age may have ended in Britain, because that political context had changed around that aspect of secularization, whereas in Canada, that's an enduring issue, is that they still have these political fights to make.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. It's like, I have started going back and looking at some of the news, like the newspaper from Secular Thought, which ran up till 1911. And there's definitely a sense of one generation ending, like this obituary after obituary, and even some of the writers are like, oh man, like last issue was rough because we lost like 3 leaders, right? Like and the people who were writing these journals and like writing these newspapers and giving these lectures are just getting on in years, and they're all dying off. So as to why there wasn't a new generation, I don't know, there was in Canada, but they came along, 15, 20 years later. I think, yeah, there's probably something to that, in that, like, especially in Quebec and in Toronto, Ontario, like the church is still very, very dominant, right? And so there's this sense of like, I think that's partly why there were short-lived groups in BC. They never really got anywhere. I think because religion was less in your face, so it's like, why bother going to an anti-religious group? Because it's like, who cares, one way or the other, right?
Yeah.
But then, yeah, I think in Winnipeg, I'm not sure, the scene is a little different. So there's probably that's probably part of it, is that political sense of, I don't even know if it's because like a lot of these guys didn't necessarily give lectures too much on like why we should get religion out of schools or stuff. It was more just attacking religion itself, right? But I think the social cultural presence of religion was strong enough that like people were like, yeah, let's get the churches out of my face, and so I want to go hear somebody attack sermons and so forth.
Tricia Gillen has 2 questions. Do you think the relative weakness of religious institutions in BC helps at all in understanding why the rationalist societies were not as robust here as in regions where Christianity's hegemony was stronger? And then I'll just read the second one as well, and you can take them one at a time. The spread of thinking about the unconscious, a la Freud, and the development of psychiatry and psychology related to the ebbing of rationalist organizations and the rise of humanism?
Well, as for the first one, yeah, I think so. Like, I think in religious indifference doesn't necessarily lend itself to religious unbelief, because, yeah, if the if the churches are relatively weak, then then who cares? Just go and I don't know, go out for brunch, right? Like, you don't have to care. You don't have to worry about as much about attacking religion. So I think, yeah. So in the book, I came across 4 different short-lived rationalist or secularist groups in Vancouver and Victoria, which only lasted a few months at a time. So there seems to have been this, like, even though unbelievers were still a small percentage of the population, there does seem to have been this more space just to not be involved with religion and not have to debunk it either. As to the other question, yeah, that's an interesting one. I'm not sure. Like, most of the people I'm looking at were very much locked into this like this idea of reason and being able to conquer ignorance, to be able to conquer superstition. And so then you see this other tradition coming from Freud, and maybe tracing back to people like Nietzsche and stuff, of like criticizing that same kind of, Enlightenment rationalism. Most of the people I'm looking at, I don't think were necessarily aware of those kind of more intellectual arguments. And yeah, I'd have to, maybe Tina would know about like how, because there were a bunch of psychiatrists who were involved with the humanists in the 1950s and 60s, like if there was any connection there. Tina, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't know, but maybe. Yeah, I don't know.
Possible.
Yeah, it's possible for sure. Yeah. Mhm. Mhm.
Bushra?
Yeah, thank you. I had a question, like, from what you mentioned now, it seems like these groups were rather homogeneous in terms of, that they were all white, and that they had this common denominator of fighting their religious environment. And I guess that is probably something that was unifying enough not to have too many internal struggles. I'm really interested in that because when you mentioned that idea of a secularist Christmas party, I was wondering if that had produced any kind of resistance for some of the members, or if they had any kind of like ideological internal struggles.
Mhm. That's a good question. Yeah, I didn't find much in Winnipeg because Gauvin was so much in charge of his organization, but there are hints in Toronto of like one week this guy gave a lecture on like, well, why are women so religious? And then the next week Jean Lang gave a talk saying like women and the church, like, and there's like senses of like how they were butting heads over, like one guy was, probably saying that, well, women are just more superstitious. And I think she was saying, well, no, there's like social reasons for these, so I think there were some differences of opinion, and that comes through in Toronto because it's a more pluralist organization. And so sometimes you see, or even debates between rationalists being held, or like different positions. So yeah, I think they did exist. But these organizations tended to be focused around one or two charismatic individuals. And so that could sometimes like push those differences under a bit to some degree. But there's a really excellent book that came out recently called The Church of St. Thomas Paine by Lee Eric Schmidt, and where he looks at the 19th century, and he moves into the 20th century as well. And he looks at the American context and how there were these big differences of opinion between different groups of unbelievers over like how much like a religion should we be, or how much should we shed all the trappings of religion, like should we have secular Christmas parties, or should we just not have those kind of parties at all, or like should we have meetings on Sundays or some other day of the week, and so like there were definitely some interesting fault lines in those communities.
So now suddenly we have a flurry of other questions right in the last 3 minutes. So what I would like you to do, Stacy, Andy, and I'm afraid I don't know your name.
Margaret.
Yeah. I'd like you to maybe ask your questions together, and then Elliot can answer very succinctly.
Okay.
Why don't we start with Stacy, Andy, and then finish with Margaret?
Great, thank you. So I was thinking broadly, kind of related to the race, gender, class questions about like what's the limits of this godless dominion that's being kind of imagined and argued for. And I was kind of struck in the BC context when you mentioned the 1923 example, because of the like one major prosecution of the potlatch ban being in 1921. And so I was curious if you came across anything, especially in terms of liberal humanism, that was related to Indigenous people.
Okay. Andy?
And I was interested in the media coverage of this movement and of the local organizations in general. Was any of it positive, for instance?
And Margaret?
Yes, I actually am a humanist and have been for at least 10, 15 years. And there's several things that I could speak to, but I would just kind of giggle at the point of Christmas because they would call it a solstice party. And there aren't very many children because we're a much elderly group, and there would be nobody with small children. They would be grandparents at best.
Well, it's interesting, yeah, the humanist group in Winnipeg, it's definitely skewed more middle-aged. I don't think there were a lot of people with young children, but yeah, they did seem to have at least one Christmas party for the kids. But, okay, so in terms of Indigenous people, these rationalists seem to have almost completely ignored them, except where they would say, there was like the guy in Vancouver, Mackay Jordan, who said he would make, ads that say, what's the difference between the primitive, rituals of savages and the superstitions of the Christians? They're all the same, and so like they would use primitive peoples as a stick to beat Christians with, right? So like, yeah, they were very much tied into the prejudices of their time, I think, towards Indigenous people. As to the press, there were some there. The Toronto Star was like the one newspaper that would give these people a lot of positive press. The Globe at the time was run by this fundamentalist, and it was just absolutely bloodthirsty and attacking them at every chance it got, right? So most of the attention they got was quite negative. Although the Sterry trial newspapers were kind of like split. They were like, oh, is this a good idea? Like maybe we should just like not prosecute people for these beliefs. Like they're wrong, but we should just leave them alone, right? But yeah, so the Toronto Star was the most positive of the press at the time.
Wow, that was really well done. Concise questions, concise answers. Thank you very much, Elliot.